your recently published book. We are here today with former National Security Advisor, John Bolton. Thank you very much for your time.
Well, thanks for having me. Glad to be with you.
We have here 577 pages of very relevant information, especially on the Trump administration. Why, Mr. Bolton, did you decide to publish this book in this specific time? And why do you think President Trump tried to stop the publication?
Well, I wrote the book because I felt it was important for history to describe what had happened during the time I spent in the White House as National Security Advisor. I did something similar when I left the George W. Bush administration in 2007. And the exact date of publication was determined by the amount of time it took me to write the book, to go through the pre-publication review process at the White House, and then the mechanics of publishing. But I do think that it's precisely during the middle of a presidential election campaign that discussing the competence and character of a candidate for president is most relevant. So I thought the timing was very advantageous.
Actually, talk about that campaign. You already confirmed for the first time in your life as a Republican, you are not going to vote for the Republican candidate.
Right. It's pretty momentous, actually. Now, I'm not going to vote for Joe Biden either for philosophical reasons. I'm going to do what many U.S. states permit. I live in Maryland, so I will write in the name of somebody else, not one of the two of them.
Before going specifically to the election, you define in your book Trump as unfit for the position of President of the United States. How would you define him personally and professionally from that perspective?
Well, you know, he does not have an overall philosophy. He's certainly not a conservative, but that doesn't mean he's a liberal either in American terms. He doesn't think in philosophical terms, in strategic terms, or policy terms. And it's one reason that it's very difficult to understand his presidency in coherent, sustained terms. He also really has little or no interest in learning things that he didn't know when he came into the White House, and there was certainly a lot that he didn't know. He doesn't fully understand the workings of the U.S. government, or really how vast it is and how many things are going on, certainly not in the national security space. And no president comes to office with that full understanding, but successful presidents are presidents who learn when they're in office and who understand they have a lot to learn, which is something Trump has never admitted.
For us to have an idea, can you give us a specific example?
Whether Finland is part of Russia, why the Korean Peninsula is divided, because he didn't understand the end of World War II, strategic nuclear weapons issues with the Russians, where he really doesn't understand what's at stake there. I mean, the list is very long, and it's because he believes, I mean, this is something he would tell people, that he thinks he can get by because of his ability to size up people, so he can evaluate foreign leaders very quickly, and then on the basis of his gut instincts, he can make deals with them that will be satisfactory, even though he doesn't really understand the subject matter of the deals themselves. This is not just my interpretation. This is what he himself has said many times.
He is very interested in using Twitter. Actually, he changed all the rules of game with that use that he does of Twitter. Even very important decisions, as for him, for example, firing you.
You know, I handed in the resignation letter and left the White House at that point, and he tweeted before I tweeted. Having seen the letter, he tweeted that he was firing me. I mean, it's a small point in the big picture, but it shows he would prefer to communicate his story regardless of whether or not it's accurate. And because Twitter moves so fast, he can often be way ahead of news coverage and really dominate it, because a few hours later he can tweet on a different subject and completely change the news coverage again. I think it was something that no other U.S. politician has understood. And no other U.S. politician really even attempts to come close to it. Now, whether it will survive when he leaves the presidency is another question, but he has used Twitter as a means of direct communication, obviously very effectively.
Do you think is President Trump aware of the consequences of his actions and decisions? How do you think is it affecting directly to the country and also abroad?
He looks at the consequences of decisions primarily in terms of how they affect him politically. And obviously the most important political question he faces now is the November 3rd election to see if he'll be reelected. But his conduct in the first 3.5 years in office has really all led up to this moment. Part of the problem of him not thinking philosophically or in strategic terms is that he changes his mind very frequently. He'll come in on a Tuesday morning and say, well, I'll decide X. But by Thursday afternoon, he could decide maybe it'll be Y, without any intervening events that might justify a change of direction. And I think that's because if you're looking at the consequences of his actions solely in political terms, you can see what could affect him on a given day. That obviously in the national security space throws allies into confusion. It leaves adversaries very unclear what U.S. objectives and intentions are. And he would say very openly, I think that's good. I'd rather have everybody guessing. In fact, I think this undercuts the ability of the U.S. to maintain its alliances and to move in a coherent fashion toward achieving its objectives.
Does he take advice of his experts like you? Did he take your advice? And do you regret anything of those 17 months in the office?
Well, I'll tell you a story about somebody else. Rudy Giuliani, some years back, before Trump actually won the election, was asked by somebody, does Trump listen to you? And Giuliani paused and said, yeah, about 20% of the time. And I don't think that has changed. There are obviously in the course of 17 months, undoubtedly many mistakes that anybody would make. I think the thing I regret most of all is not being able to create any kind of process that could bring order and consistency to the president's decision-making. That's really what the National Security Council process is all about. Providing the president with information he needs, providing him with options for policy decisions, and then following through on the implementation of the decisions that a president makes.
For you, Ambassador, which were the major challenges you had to handle?
Well, I think one of the things I would point to as an achievement of my time in the White House was no bad agreements were entered into. No bad agreement with North Korea on its nuclear weapons program, no bad agreement with Iran on its nuclear weapons program, no bad agreement with China on strategic issues, no bad agreements with Russia on nuclear weapons. In fact, getting out of some agreements that constrain the United States. But I think what concerns me more than anything else at the moment is that since so many of Trump's decisions in his first term were based on domestic political considerations, that constraint will not exist if he's reelected. In many cases during my time at the White House, we were able to say, if you do X, there will be a very negative reaction from Republicans in Congress. And for the political reason, the obvious political reason, he would often then not do X. But in a second term, once he's reelected, he doesn't need the Republican base anymore. The guardrail of that political constraint will be eliminated or substantially diminished. So many of the decisions he made, I think, correctly in the first term, I could see him reversing them in the second term.
It's still open. What do you think it's going to happen? Because for now, what we know is that Biden is leading those polls. The same thing happened with Hillary Clinton in 2016, but it looks like there's some kind of hidden vote for Trump.
Well, I don't know if there's a hidden vote or not. I think, although there's still roughly 3 months until the election in American political terms, that's eternity. I think that the possibility of what we call an October surprise is very real. Would he have a fourth summit meeting with Kim Jong-un to declare peace on the Korean Peninsula and an end to their nuclear weapons program? Not that it would happen, but he would declare it. Might he decide to withdraw all U.S. forces from Afghanistan even before the election? Could he say he was going to withdraw from NATO? I mean, the number of things that he might do if he's still trailing in the public opinion polls in October is really quite large. And then, Vice President Biden will have 3 debates with President Trump in September and October. And if he does not perform well in those debates, that could be very beneficial to Trump. So I like to tell people, especially foreign observers, never underestimate the ability of the Democratic Party to blow an election. And they still have 3 months to do it.
And there are still some other things that we heard that could happen. You explained that in your book also. Trump asked China to support his re-election. But now it looks like that relationship is changing, because actually we are already talking about Cold War. And the pandemic has a lot of things to do with that, because as we have heard the president mention as a Chinese virus. So is China a real threat for the United States, or they need each other?
Well, I think in the 21st century as a whole, China is the gravest strategic challenge that the United States and the West as a whole faces. It's true that at the moment, Trump's rhetoric is very hard line on China, and he's taken some significant actions, imposing economic sanctions on China, closing their consulate in Houston, Texas. That's all true. But the fact is that if he wins re-election, if Xi Jinping were to call him the day after the election, I could easily see Trump reversing all of these things in order to get back to negotiating the big trade deal. He's called it the deal of the century. I think that's very dangerous. And I think we've seen with companies like Huawei, which China uses not as a business entity, a commercial competitor in the telecommunications industry. It's an arm of the Chinese state. So this is something I think everyone in the U.S. and Europe is coming to very late. I think we are late recognizing this Chinese threat.
If it's reelected or not, how is that future going to be for the Republican Party? And who would you think could be an ideal candidate to lead the party for the next stage?
Well, I think after November 3rd, there's going to be a huge discussion within the Republican Party. Certainly, it's important. If Trump loses, it will begin immediately. But even if Trump wins, it will begin, because I think people who see it as I do want to cut this albatross off from around our neck and try and prevent it from happening into the future. I think we can repair the damage that Trump has done in the first term. I think a second term would be very hard to repair. And I don't have a candidate myself in 2024, and I wouldn't want to name anybody before our election in November. I don't want to get anybody into trouble. But there will be a very active campaign to be that nominee in 2024, and that will tell us a lot about the shape of the party as well.
Because Trump responds to a specific profile we have seen in other countries recently. Do you think the next candidate would be someone very different to him?
Well, I hope so. I mean, I think we want somebody who takes the office seriously, who understands the gravity of the decisions that he has to make, and I think really somebody who can perform in a consistent way over a sustained period of time. I don't think national security is like a series of real estate deals in Manhattan, one after the other. It's a long-term process. We know China's pursuing a very long-term strategy. We need an American president who can respond in similar terms.
We are in the middle of a crisis, the pandemic, COVID-19. It's affecting all the countries in the world, but specifically here in the United States. How do you think President Trump is managing this crisis?
Well, I think he's not handling the crisis very well. I don't think he has from the beginning, even in early January. He was getting signals from the National Security Council staff and elsewhere that this was going to be a very serious problem. But he didn't want to hear any bad news about Xi Jinping. He wanted to sign the interim trade deal in January. He didn't want to hear anything about China covering up the disease in China or a disinformation campaign about it worldwide. And he didn't want to hear that the disease could adversely affect the U.S. economy, which he saw as his ticket to re-election. Now, that's all changed because obviously the effects of the disease are so serious. And so he's prepared to criticize China now because it's in his political advantage to do so, but it may not be after the election.
Do you, Ambassador, use a mask?
Oh, I do absolutely use a mask. I think it's the prudent thing to do.
And what do you think the president is not using one?
I think he fundamentally thinks that wearing a mask would be a sign of weakness to some people in his base. I actually don't think that's what people think. I think if the president said, this is a very serious disease we're facing, and as with other challenges, America is going to prevail over it. But in the meantime, here are the steps we have to take. We're all going to take them, starting with me. You'd have 100% of people wearing the mask.
Venezuela, one of the top issues and problems, let's say, in your agenda as a former national security advisor. What happened on April 30? Was information filtered before taking action? Or was it that pressure of Cuban Russians that made things fail at last minute?
Well, I think we all knew that supporting the Venezuelan opposition and interim President Juan Guaido was going to be very risky. The opposition itself understood that when they undertook to replace Maduro as president. But they worked hard. The opposition stayed together. I think they represent 90% of the people of Venezuela. They had conversations with key leaders inside Maduro's government, and they thought that they had a deal worked out that would move Maduro out of power. And I'll tell you, on April the 30th last year, they came very close. They came very close. It's hard to put into words just how close they came. I think it's hard to say what went wrong. You know, in these situations, probably a lot of things went wrong. But the most important factor, and really the reason that the United States has been concerned at a global level about Maduro's regime, was the presence of foreigners that protected Maduro and kept him in power. And that starts with the Cubans, who took Maduro to Fort Tiuna in Caracas and kept him there when he and his wife were really prepared to flee to Havana on April 30th, backed by the Russians and ultimately by the Chinese and the Iranians, who think Maduro's their man in Caracas. So I think if the Cubans and the other foreigners were to leave today, Maduro would fall by tomorrow. And that's why I ultimately believe he will fall and the people of Venezuela will be given their government back.
He is still in power with more than 60 countries recognizing Juan Guaido as a president of Venezuela. Do you think it's still possible, his way out of power of Maduro? Do you think it's possible, or he's stronger than ever after what happened?
He's definitely not stronger than ever. Even the military and the rank and file don't support him. The opposition would say 80 to 90% of the military really is opposed to him. It's the top generals, the top officials of his regime who benefit from staying in power. I do think we underestimated how much revenue they got from illegal narcotics trafficking. So even when we squeezed them economically, the regime was able to hold on. I think there's a lot more we could do. And I think it's important to maintain the international coalition that supports Juan Guaido. This revolution was made in Venezuela. It wasn't made in Washington. And ultimately, the people of Venezuela will succeed. I don't think they can be repressed forever.
We all could see that 5,000 soldiers in your notes at the press room at the White House. Was that a strategy to threaten Maduro's regime, or you were really willing to send some militaries to support, to remove him from power?
Well, we did a lot to try and persuade Maduro that he should leave. That particular note was not part of the strategy. But I think we were clear we were never going to take the military option off the table, although it wasn't anything that we had planned. I think it's very important that the best kind of outcome in Venezuela would be for the people themselves to overthrow the Maduro regime. And I think that's still very, very possible.
I'll say a name, Vladimir Padrino, Minister of Defense. If he leaves the power, do you think that Maduro can fall too?
Look, I think Padrino basically agreed to get Maduro out of power. I think when the effort on April 30 started to collapse, he pulled back. But I don't think anybody in the top circles of Maduro's regime trusts anybody anymore. And they shouldn't, because given the right kind of deal, I think they would turn on Maduro very quickly. And one way or another, I think the cracks in the regime at the top will bring it down.
His son, the Vladimir Padrino's son, and a family of other members of officials of Maduro's regime are living in Europe, like the good life, they say, right? In Europe, specifically in Spain. Do you think European Union should take action?
Spain has a particular role it could play here if the government wanted to, given Spain's role in the Western Hemisphere. I think it could do a lot more. I think the European Union could do a lot more. But I think the main point is that if we make it clear to Padrino and others that there's no future in this regime, they will turn on it again. It's not just Padrino whose family is living overseas. Many of the other top regime figures have their families in Central America, in Cuba, in Europe, some of them in the United States. That's not the sign of a government that has confidence in its own future. So look, we were all disappointed last year when the effort failed. It seems like this struggle has gone on a long time. But thinking of the Venezuelan people, we need to continue it as long as it takes to overthrow this regime.
And what about the role of Spain you were mentioning? Because Spain has always been a big support in terms of Latin American relationships also for the United States. Did that recently change? How did it change?
Well, I think the government of Spain really could point out in across Latin America and countries that are still supporting Maduro that this really is not in their interest, and that as Spain itself turned away from autocracy toward democracy successfully, that should be the ideal across Latin America as well. I think Spain's obvious historical role here is very important.
How do you see Spain from here? And also, we've been affected, some of our bestseller products with this protectionism and these duties recently, they have been affected. But in general, they think they have good relationships with the United States. How do you, how do you see from your perspective that relationships, and what else do you think would be improved?
Well, I think historically Spain and the United States have had an excellent relationship after some early difficulties at the beginning and an occasional disagreement, as with Cuba in the 1890s and that sort of thing. But after the Spanish-American War, I think the natural tendency has been to have good relations. Spain is an Atlanticist country because of its history, if nothing else. And so there's always been a closeness with the United States. And I think that it's been significant that the U.S. supported Spain coming into NATO, even under the Franco regime. And it's very important now that Spain once again get its defense expenditures up to the 2% of GDP that the NATO countries agreed to. Spain faces a lot of threats from terrorism, again, because it's a Mediterranean power. And I think it's important for the U.S. and Europe generally to have a better relationship given the challenge of Russia and China that we face around the world. So there's a lot of work to be done, but it's an important relationship from the U.S. perspective. If the Venezuela thing doesn't demonstrate anything else, I think it shows how working together we could accomplish a lot more.
The room where it happened, the book we are talking about today, 17 months in the office as former National Security Advisor of President Donald Trump. This is an end of stage, a professional state that you mentioned before, as you did with other books. So just to finish this interview, Ambassador, where do you see yourself maybe in a near future with another different president? Would you go back to the White House if you were called?
Sure, I'm not looking forward to that. I think the most important thing, especially after the election, is the discussion about the future of the Republican Party. So I'm focused on that, focused on keeping a Republican majority in the U.S. Senate, which is also up for election in November, and we'll see what happens after that.
Okay, so thank you so much for your time, John Bolton, and we really appreciate you were with us today.
Well, thank you again for having me.